You have been looking at this tree for 2 years. Not every day, but you know it. You know which side gets the most wind. You know how it leans. You know the curve of the trunk just above the roots, and you have already decided what that curve will become. Most people walk past a forest and see trees. You walk past a forest and see ships, keels and strakes and ribs and stems. You see the vessel before the wood has been touched, before the axe has come anywhere near it. This is not a romantic idea. It is a skill that took years to develop and more years to trust. And in the Norse world, between roughly the 8th and 11th centuries, it may have been the most consequential skill a person could possess. Because without the ship, there is no raid, no trade, no exploration, no settlement across open water. The ship is not a tool the Viking Age used. The ship is the reason the Viking Age happened at all. Shipbuilding in the Norse world was not a profession in the way a modern trade is a profession. There was no guild, no formal certification, no single path into the work. What there was knowledge, and knowledge moved through families and communities across generations. Many shipbuilders learned the craft from a father, an uncle, or a master builder within their community who took on younger workers as assistants. You learned by doing, by holding timber while someone more experienced shaped it, by watching how a builder read the grain of the wood, by gradually taking on more complex tasks as your judgment was trusted further. Your status in Norse society was not fixed by the craft alone. Norse society was stratified into broadly three groups: the jarls at the top, free farmers and craftsmen in the middle, and thralls, enslaved people, at the bottom. A skilled shipbuilder was likely a free man, and skill in a craft as critical as shipbuilding carried genuine social weight. A master builder capable of producing vessels for a powerful chieftain or jarl occupied a respected position in his community. Some shipbuilders may have worked primarily for a single lord or community. Others may have traveled, their skills making them valuable across different settlements and regions. The archaeological and historical record on the daily social lives of individual craftsmen is limited. So much of what we can say about this comes from inference and from what surviving Norse sources tell us about how craft and skill were valued. What is clear is that the knowledge you carried was irreplaceable. There were no written manuals, no technical drawings. The design lived in the minds and hands of experienced builders, passed person to person, refined through practice and failure and the hard feedback of the sea. Before any tool touched any timber, the wood had to be found, selected, and prepared. This was not a minor preliminary step. It was the foundation on which everything else depended. Oak was the primary timber for major Norse vessels, particularly in Scandinavia. It was dense, strong, and, critically, capable of being split along its grain in ways that preserved the natural strength of the wood fiber. But oak was not the only material used. Pine, ash, and other locally available timbers appear in the archaeological record depending on the region and the type of vessel being built. The selection process was serious and deliberate. You were not simply looking for large, straight timber. You were looking for wood whose natural shape matched the shapes the ship required. A plank curved in the right direction. A branch or root with the right angle for a specific structural piece. Forcing wood into a shape that went against its grain produced weaker results. Working with the natural form of the timber produced something stronger and more resilient. This is why a skilled builder looked at a forest differently from anyone else. The ship was, in a real sense, found in the wood before it was built. The builder's job was to see what was already there and match it to what the vessel needed. Once selected, timber was often worked green, freshly cut, rather than fully dried. Green wood is more flexible and easier to shape. It could be split cleanly, bent without cracking, and worked with axes and edzes to a degree that dried hardwood resists. As it dried in place on the vessel, it tightened and hardened, which was part of the design. Splitting, rather than sawing, was the dominant technique for producing planks. A split plank follows the natural grain of the wood all the way through. A sawn plank cuts across grain lines and can be weaker as a result. This distinction sounds technical, but had real consequences for a vessel that would be flexing in open water under sail and oar. You did not have a workshop full of specialized machinery. You had a small set of hand tools, considerable physical strength, and an intimate understanding of how wood behaves. The axe was your primary instrument, not the broad-bladed weapon associated with Norse warriors, but a precision tool in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. A skilled builder could shape a plank to consistent thickness with an axe in ways that took years of practice to achieve reliably. The adze, a curved blade set perpendicular to the handle, was used for finishing surfaces and harrowing. Chisels, knives, augers for boring holes, and various wedges and mallets completed the basic toolkit. The technique used to build Norse ships is called clinker construction, or lapstrake. The planks of the hull, called strakes, were overlapped at their edges and fastened together rather than being placed edge to edge. This overlap was not merely structural. It created a hull that was flexible under stress rather than rigid. In open water, where waves push and pull a vessel from multiple directions simultaneously, a degree of flex is not a weakness. It is what keeps the ship from breaking apart. This is one of the defining and remarkable features of Norse shipbuilding. The vessels were deliberately designed to move. Sailors who traveled in them described the hull working, flexing and shifting in rough conditions. That was correct behavior, not a failure. Getting to that design outcome required not just knowing the technique, but understanding deeply why it worked and how to execute it consistently across every plank of the hull. Fastenings were iron rivets, clinched through the overlapping planks and clenched on the inside over small square washers called roves. The iron had to be produced, shaped, and applied correctly. Too loose and the joint leaked and weakened. Too tight and the flex that made the hull resilient was restricted. Even the metalwork required judgment and experience. Caulking the seams, making them watertight, was done with tarred animal hair or wool pressed into the overlaps. This too had to be done correctly. A ship that leaked from poor caulking was not just uncomfortable. In cold northern waters, it was dangerous. Not all Norse vessels were the same, and understanding the differences was part of your expertise. The longship is the image most people carry. Long, narrow, shallow drafted, built for speed and the ability to be beached directly on shore or rowed up rivers. It was a raiding and military vessel designed to move fast and put warriors on a beach with minimum delay. Its shallow draft, the depth of hull below the waterline, meant it could operate in waters that deeper vessels could not reach. The Knarr was a different animal, broader, deeper, higher-sided, built for cargo rather than speed. The Norse trading and settlement voyages across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America, were made in vessels like this, not longships. A Knarr could carry livestock, timber, trade goods, and settlers across open ocean in conditions that would have been miserable in a longship. You might spend your career building primarily one type, or you might build both. The skills overlapped, but the priorities differed. A longship demanded the lightest possible construction consistent with structural integrity. Every unnecessary pound of hull was weight that slowed the vessel or made it harder to carry overland between waterways. A Knarr demanded robustness and cargo capacity and could accept more weight in its construction because speed was less critical than reliability over long ocean passages. The largest longships were significant construction projects, the great ships described in Norse sagas, some of which are likely exaggerated, represent a scale of organized labor and resource that required a chieftain or king with real economic power to commission. Even a more modest vessel required weeks or months of sustained work, quality timber, iron fittings, rope, sailcloth, and the sustained effort of multiple workers. Building a ship was physical labor of a demanding and sustained kind. You worked outdoors in most cases, or in a simple shelter that kept rain off the timber rather than providing any real comfort. Scandinavian weather, cold, wet, windy for much of the year, was your working environment. Work did not stop because the temperature dropped. The timber still needed to be shaped. The rivets still needed to be driven. The work required both strength and precision, which is an unusual combination. Splitting a large oak log required sustained physical force. Shaping a plank to the exact thickness and curve required fine judgment and controlled movement. Both in the same day, every day. You worked alongside other men. A ship of any significant size was not built by one person. There was a master builder whose judgment governed decisions. How the keel was laid, how the stem and stern were shaped, how the strakes curved up from the waterline. Around that master builder were workers of varying skill and experience, each contributing according to what they knew and what they had been trusted to do. The rhythm of the work was set by the project. Unlike farming, which had a seasonal calendar with defined periods of peak labor and relative quiet, Shipbuilding moved at the pace of the vessel taking shape. Some stages were painstaking and slow. Others moved quickly once a technique was established. Progress was visible and tangible in a way that had its own satisfaction. At the end of each day, the ship was more of a ship than it had been at the start. Finishing a ship was not a quiet moment. In Norse society, a ship was among the most valuable objects a community or chieftain could possess. The labor, the materials, the knowledge concentrated in a finished vessel represented an enormous investment. When that vessel was completed and ready for water, it mattered. We know from Norse sources and archaeological evidence that ships held deep cultural and spiritual significance beyond their practical function. Ships appear in burial contexts. Some of the most important figures in Norse society were buried in ships, with the vessel serving as a vehicle for the journey after death. Ships appear in stone carvings, in poetry, in the language itself. The Norse vocabulary for ships and the sea is extensive and specific in ways that reflect how central these objects were to the culture. As the builder, you had a particular relationship to the finished vessel. You knew every plank. You knew where the difficult grain had required extra care and where the wood had cooperated. You knew the decisions that had been made in the building, the ones that had gone well and the ones that had required correction, whether the ship performed as intended, whether it was fast, stable, and seaworthy, reflected directly on your skill and your judgment. A vessel that handled badly or leaked persistently was not an abstract failure. It was a public one, in a community where reputation was a serious and consequential thing. A ship that handled well, that survived rough crossings and came back, was evidence of something harder to name than technical competence. It was proof that the knowledge had been correctly held and correctly applied, that the wood had been read accurately, that the design that existed in your mind before the first plank was shaped had translated faithfully into something real. The Viking shipbuilder's life was the Viking age seen from the inside, from the ground up, from the forest to the water. Everything that the Norse world is remembered for, the exploration, the trade, the raids, the settlements at the edge of the known world, was made possible by the knowledge that lived in the hands and judgment of people who spent their lives learning how to read wood and turn it into something that could survive the open sea. What made this life genuinely difficult was the standard it demanded. There was no room for a plank that was close enough, no room for caulking that was mostly watertight. The sea is an absolute judge. A vessel that was nearly well built was a vessel that could kill everyone aboard it somewhere between Norway and Iceland with no warning and no second chance. What is most misunderstood about this role is how much of it was knowledge rather than physical strength. The strength was necessary, but strength without the accumulated understanding of wood, water, and design produced nothing useful. The knowledge was the thing, and it could not be written down, could not be stored anywhere except in the minds of people who had spent years learning it and years more trusting it. You looked at a tree for 2 years before you touched it. That is not patience. That is expertise. The ship was already there. You just had to be skilled enough to find it.